When we picture the Middle Ages, it's easy to think of knights in shining armor, castles perched on hills, and peasants trudging through muddy fields. But beneath the pageantry and romance, there was a much darker reality: justice. And medieval justice was not polite, not subtle, and definitely not gentle. It was harsh, it was public, and sometimes it was downright bizarre. Before you settle in, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. And if you enjoy these late-night wanderings through history, consider subscribing. Maybe leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights and let's begin. Back in the Middle Ages, prisons weren't the main way to punish people. In fact, the idea of long-term prison sentences as a standard punishment is pretty modern. Medieval rulers didn't want to waste resources feeding someone who had stolen a loaf of bread or cheated on their taxes. They wanted punishments that made an example out of people, punishments that taught lessons, and most importantly, punishments that everyone could watch. You see, medieval justice wasn't only about the criminal, it was about the crowd. Every punishment doubled as theatre, staged in the marketplace or the town square. And like any good show, it needed to keep the audience entertained while driving home the moral of the story. Do wrong, and this could be you. It was deterrence mixed with spectacle, where the line between law enforcement and public entertainment often blurred. And while some punishments were incredibly violent, not all of them involved blood or pain. Sometimes the most effective punishments didn't need a sword or an axe, they only needed shame. Which brings us to one of the most famous medieval punishments of all, the stocks and the pillories. Now, if you've ever seen a medieval movie or even a cartoon, you've probably seen these. The stocks were basically a wooden frame with holes cut out for the ankles. You'd sit down, your legs trapped through the holes, and you'd be stuck in place for hours or even days. The pillory was the standing version, clamping your head and hands into position so you couldn't move. Imagine being frozen in a very uncomfortable squat, only you can't scroll your phone, can't move your arms, and can't even scratch your nose when it itches. Sounds bad already, right? Well, the real punishment wasn't just being stuck there. The real punishment was the audience, because once you were locked into the stocks or pillories, the town came alive. People gathered around, and this wasn't just casual passing by. They came prepared. They brought rotten vegetables, eggs, fish heads, whatever smelled bad and would make a mess. And they hurled it at you, not once, not twice, but for hours. Imagine being pelted with yesterday's cabbage while everyone you know, your neighbors, your co-workers, even your family, stood by to laugh at you. That sting of humiliation could be more painful than any physical blow. It wasn't just food either. People would spit, throw mud, shout insults, and sometimes worse. If you were unpopular, you might find yourself dodging rocks, and if you'd crossed the wrong crowd, well, let's just say the authorities weren't too concerned if things got a little rough. After all, wasn't the point to suffer? What's interesting here is how the punishment turned ordinary citizens into participants. The crowd didn't just watch, they joined in. It was a community event. Everyone got to be part of the justice system, whether they were throwing moldy bread or shouting their best insult. Think of it as the medieval version of social media. Today, people leave nasty comments on Twitter or Instagram. Back then, they just hurled literal garbage, less typing, more rotten tomatoes. And like modern social media, it was about public shaming. A thief caught stealing a chicken wasn't just punished with fines or jail time. He was displayed in the stocks for all to see, branded in memory as the guy who got egged last week. Your reputation could be ruined permanently, which was sometimes a harsher sentence than the punishment itself. This kind of justice worked especially well in small towns where everyone knew each other. In a big city, maybe you could blend back into the crowd, but in a village, forget it. The memory of you standing in the stocks while children smeared mud in your hair would follow you for years. It wasn't only petty thieves who ended up there. Drunkards, cheats, people who lied too much, even those accused of slander or gossip might find themselves locked in wood. The punishment could last for a few hours, a full day, or multiple days. Sometimes people were left overnight, enduring rain or cold. And unlike prison where your suffering was hidden behind walls, this was all out in the open, designed for maximum humiliation. The humiliation part was so powerful because medieval society valued reputation and honor above almost everything else. For peasants and townsfolk alike, your good name was your survival. Once that was stained, it was almost impossible to repair. So the stocks weren't just about punishing your crime. They were about branding you socially, marking you out as someone who had failed the community. There's a cruel brilliance in that. No guard needed to hit you, no executioner needed to swing a weapon. The crowd became the punishment. The wooden frame simply held you there long enough for your shame to sink in. Of course, not everyone saw the stocks as misery. Some people, especially in larger towns, turned them into a kind of sideshow. Imagine walking through a market and seeing someone you didn't like locked in the pillory. You'd stop, toss a tomato, laugh with your friends, and move on with your day. It added a certain chaotic entertainment value to daily life, the way people now slow down to watch a fight video or a celebrity scandal. Human nature hasn't changed much. We've just traded the square for a screen. What's also striking is how flexible this punishment was. Authorities loved it because it cost almost nothing to enforce. No expensive jails, no complicated executions, just a wooden frame and a public square. For the community, it was a chance to participate in justice. For the accused, it was a punishment that could leave lasting scars on their dignity without necessarily leaving physical ones. Though, let's be honest, getting pelted with rocks and rotten produce wasn't exactly painless either. And while it may sound like a relic of the distant past, versions of this practice lasted much longer than you'd expect. Stocks and pillories were still used well into the 18th century in some parts of Europe and even in colonial America. Public humiliation proved to be a hard habit to break. So next time you imagine medieval justice, don't just think of dungeons and axes. Picture instead a crowded town square, a poor soul locked in a wooden frame, and an eager audience armed with turnips, insults, and way too much enthusiasm. It was punishment as performance, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, the court of public opinion didn't just ruin reputations, it literally hit you in the face. And as creative as that was, it was only the beginning. Because when it came to punishing people, especially women accused of causing trouble, medieval society had an even stranger invention waiting. Picture this: you live in a small medieval town where gossip spreads faster than a plague rat through the market square. Now, in our world today, gossip might earn you an awkward glare or maybe a passive-aggressive Facebook post, but back then, the town had a special punishment lined up for anyone, usually women, accused of being too loud, too sharp-tongued, or just generally inconvenient to the delicate male ego of the Middle Ages. Enter the ducking stool. It wasn't just a chair. No, this was a contraption designed with one purpose: humiliation through hydraulics. Imagine a sturdy wooden chair fixed to a long seesaw-like beam, stretched out over a river, pond, or whatever gross body of water was nearby. The accused would be strapped in, tied tightly, and wheeled out over the water as the townsfolk gathered, ready for the spectacle. Then came the moment. Down she went. A splash, sputtering, gasps for air, then back up again, only to be dunked straight back down. The punishment was for scolds, women accused of nagging, gossiping, or arguing too much. It was also trotted out for those suspected of witchcraft. Basically, if a woman spoke her mind or didn't behave according to the strict social script, this watery roller coaster from hell was waiting. Think of it like medieval behavior correction, but with a lot more mud and fewer safety rails. Sometimes the dunking was short and sharp, meant to terrify rather than kill. The idea was that a soaking, plus the humiliation of being paraded in front of neighbors, would shut a person up far more effectively than locking them in a cell. After all, medieval justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about performance. The crowd wasn't just there to watch, they were there to judge, to sneer, to point fingers, to make an example of the unfortunate victims strapped to the stool. But here's the sinister twist: this punishment could, and did, turn fatal. Imagine being strapped down, dunked again and again, lungs burning, the line between punishment and execution growing very thin. Sometimes the accused didn't resurface. Whether that was the intention or simply an unfortunate accident depended on who you asked. And yet communities justified it. The ducking stool wasn't just about silencing a gossip or punishing a so-called witch. It was a form of social control, neatly packaged as entertainment. The message was clear: step outside your role, talk too much, question too loudly, and you'd find yourself spluttering in the village pond with half the town cheering you on. If you squint at it, you can almost see the bizarre logic. A fine or imprisonment? That only punishes the individual, but a public dunking that punishes and entertains. Everyone got the warning, everyone got the thrill, and society's order was kept intact for a while at least. It was humiliation dressed up as justice, fear dressed up as tradition, and of course, as always, those who held the power got to decide who deserved the plunge and who didn't. But if you thought a bit of waterboarding medieval style was harsh, wait until you hear about what came next. Because not all punishments were designed to be so wet and wild. Some were fiery, some bloody, and some simply bizarre. If the ducking stool wasn't enough to silence a so-called troublesome woman, the Middle Ages had another device up its iron sleeve, literally. Enter the scold's bridle, also known as the Brank's bridle. Picture this: a heavy iron cage shaped to fit over a person's head, complete with a spiked plate that pressed down on the tongue. Talk too much? Complain? Gossip? Congratulations! You've just won yourself the medieval version of a noise-cancelling headset. Except instead of drowning out sound, it silenced you. The bridle was as cruel as it was theatrical. Imagine being locked into this iron contraption, the weight of the cage pressing on your skull, while that nasty little tongue piece dug into the flesh of your mouth. One wrong move, one attempt to speak or cry out, and the spikes jabbed deeper. Talking became impossible. Eating, forget it. Even swallowing was an exercise in pain. It was designed to make sure that if you had words to say, they never made it past your teeth. But this wasn't a punishment hidden away in some dungeon. Oh no, this was a public affair. Victims were paraded through the streets, iron masks glinting in the sun, while the townsfolk pointed and laughed. Sometimes a bell was even attached to the bridle, so the entire neighborhood could hear you coming, because humiliation worked best with maximum exposure. And it wasn't just a tool of silence, it was a tool of control. By making someone a walking spectacle of pain, the authorities didn't just punish one person, they warned everyone else. Step out of line, and this could be you clanging down the cobblestones with your head in a cage. Now the irony here is almost too sharp to ignore. The bridle was supposedly meant to stop gossip, to prevent nagging, to preserve peace in the community. But in practice, it created the very spectacle it claimed to prevent. Instead of silencing drama, it put it on parade. A woman with a bridle wasn't just quiet. She became the day's main attraction, a medieval reality show episode come to life. And yet, behind the jeering crowd and the painful ironwork, the punishment revealed something deeper: society's fear of voices that couldn't be controlled. The bridle was less about gossip and more about dominance. It was a cage for both the mouth and the mind. But if you think a spiked head cage is bad, buckle up, because medieval justice didn't stop at humiliation or silence. Some punishments weren't just about shutting you up, they were about putting your entire body on trial in ways that make the scold's bridle look like a nasty party trick. By now, it should be clear that medieval punishments weren't exactly about fairness. They were about spectacle, control, and sometimes just plain cruelty. But if you thought the scold's bridle was harsh, let's step into the world of something far more terrifying: trial by ordeal. This wasn't punishment in the sense of do the crime, do the time. No, this was punishment dressed up as justice, where guilt or innocence wasn't determined by evidence, but by whether or not you could survive torture. The twisted logic went something like this: if you were truly innocent, surely God would intervene and save you. If you weren't, well, you'd probably die, which neatly solved the problem for everyone else. Divine justice, medieval style. So what did these ordeals look like? Brace yourself, because they weren't subtle. One of the most infamous was the ordeal of hot iron. Here's how it worked. The accused had to carry a red-hot piece of iron, sometimes a bar, sometimes a ball, in their bare hands, and then walk a set number of paces. Afterward, the priests would carefully bandage the burned hands and check them after a few days. If the wounds miraculously healed without infection, congratulations, you were innocent. If they festered, blistered, and looked like, well, a normal burn from carrying molten metal, you were guilty. Another favorite was the ordeal of boiling water. This one required plunging your arm elbow deep into a cauldron of scalding water to retrieve a stone or a ring placed at the bottom. Much like the hot iron ordeal, the healing process afterwards supposedly revealed whether you were guilty or not. Spoiler. It usually just revealed that boiling water gives you third-degree burn. And then there was fire itself, which had a starring role in plenty of ordeals. Walking barefoot over glowing embers, holding burning objects. Sometimes it was as simple as being tied up and thrown into flames to see how long you lasted. The logic wasn't so much if you survive, you're innocent, as it was if you die quickly, you must have been guilty. Either way, not exactly a win for the accused. Of course, the most famous ordeal, the one that people still talk about in the context of witch trials, was the ordeal of water, also known as trial by drowning. This one was truly maddening in its twisted logic. The accused would be bound, usually hand and foot, and tossed into a river, lake, or pond. If they sank, that meant the water had accepted them as pure, innocent souls. The problem? Innocent or not, drowning still kills you. On the other hand, if you floated, the water was supposedly rejecting you, marking you as guilty, at which point you'd be hauled out and punished anyway, often executed. It was the definition of a lose-lose scenario. Now, to modern ears, this all sounds completely absurd. But in the Middle Ages, it was deadly serious. These ordeals weren't sideshows. They were official legal practices blessed by priests and supported by kings. The church especially played a huge role, since the entire system relied on the belief that God would step in to reveal the truth. To refuse an ordeal wasn't really an option. It was seen as refusing God's judgment. And yet, behind the religious veneer, there was plenty of human manipulation going on. Priests sometimes helped God along by, let's say, tilting the odds. Maybe the iron wasn't quite as hot for someone the church favored. Maybe the bandages were treated with healing herbs to make recovery more likely for the well-connected. On the flip side, if the authorities wanted you gone, they could stack the deck to make survival impossible. It was divine will with a heavy dose of human bias. What's especially striking about trial by ordeal is that it didn't really aim for truth in any rational sense. It was about reinforcing power structures. If you were poor, powerless, or unpopular, the ordeal was a quick way to eliminate you while maintaining the illusion of fairness. The community could shrug and say, well, God decided, even though everyone knew it was really the flames, the water, or the iron doing the deciding. And yet, as grim as these ordeals sound, they also carried a bizarre kind of reassurance for people at the time. Life in the Middle Ages was full of uncertainty, famine, plague, war, sudden death. The ordeal system gave people a sense of order, however twisted. It created the illusion that divine justice was always watching, that truth would eventually come out, even if it required a few horrific burns or drownings along the way. The cruelty of it is almost comical when you think about how far from logic it really was. Imagine explaining it to someone today. We'll prove your innocence by tossing you into boiling water. Don't worry, if God likes you, you won't get infected. It's medieval justice at its most absurd, where theology, superstition, and sadism met in one fiery, watery package. But trial by ordeal wasn't just about individuals, it was about communities. These events were public, drawing crowds eager to watch divine judgment in action. It was part religious ritual, part courtroom drama, and part brutal entertainment. People gathered to see whether their neighbor, their rival, or that mysterious stranger would emerge as blessed by God or cursed as a sinner. It was collective theatre, where everyone got to witness justice unfold before their eyes. Over time, though, cracks began to appear. By the 13th century, even some church leaders started to question the logic of ordeals. They realized that God, inconveniently, didn't always intervene in ways that matched expectations. Sometimes the innocent got burned, sometimes the guilty healed just fine. The illusion of divine certainty began to fray, and gradually ordeals lost their status as legitimate trials. Still, the legacy of these ordeals lingers. The phrase trial by fire comes straight out of this brutal history, and while we no longer dunk people in rivers or make them hold red-hot iron bars, the idea of being tested in extreme ways, where survival itself becomes proof, remains a powerful metaphor. What makes it all the more fascinating is how trial by ordeal fits perfectly into the broader pattern of medieval punishment. It wasn't enough to punish quietly or behind closed doors. The point was to make punishment visible, dramatic, unforgettable. The same logic that put a scold's bridle on a gossiping woman or chained a drunkard in the town square fueled the spectacle of ordeals. Justice had to be seen to be believed, even if that justice was nothing more than cruelty dressed up as divine will. And speaking of public spectacles, not all medieval punishments involved fire and water. Some took a more theatrical approach, blending humiliation with bizarre creativity. Imagine being forced into an outfit designed not to protect your dignity, but to strip it away entirely. An outfit so ridiculous, it announced your shame to the entire world. If you thought medieval punishments were extreme with scold's bridles and boiling water, hold on to your seat, because things are about to get darker, heavier, and frankly, almost unthinkable. We're stepping into the world of flaying alive, one of the most brutal forms of punishment ever recorded in human history. Flaying, in case you're wondering, is exactly what it sounds like, the act of removing a person's skin while they're still alive. And while it might sound like something out of a horror movie, it was very much a historical reality, especially for traitors, rebels, and anyone who had seriously angered the powers that be. Medieval Europe had its fair share of cruelty, but this punishment had echoes reaching back to civilizations like the Assyrians, whose brutality is legendary. Even if flaying wasn't always standard procedure in Europe, its symbolic weight made occasional appearances, and when it did, it was a public affair designed to terrify everyone who might dare defy authority. Imagine for a moment the mindset behind such a punishment. The medieval world was intensely hierarchical, ruled by kings, lords, and the church. Power wasn't just about armies or taxes, it was about fear. The more horrifying and memorable the punishment, the more firmly authority was reinforced. Flaying wasn't just about killing someone, It was about sending a message so vivid that people would remember it for generations. It screamed, "This is what happens if you betray or defy us. Don't even think about it." The mechanics were simple in concept, but horrifying in practice. Victims were usually restrained in some way, tied down so they couldn't move, and skilled executioners, yes, it was considered a skill, would strip away their skin, often starting at the limbs and working inward. The public nature of the punishment amplified the terror. It wasn't done behind castle walls or in a quiet dungeon. Townsfolk, soldiers, and sometimes even curious travelers were invited to witness. The suffering was meant to be both a spectacle and a lesson. Historically, flaying served a dual purpose. One, of course, was punishment, severe, personal, and absolute. But two, it was symbolic. To strip someone of their skin is to strip them of identity, honor, and humanity. In a society where reputation and social standing were paramount, flaying communicated that a traitor or criminal could lose everything, literally and figuratively. You were no longer a person, you became a warning, an object lesson, a cautionary tale, etched into the memories of everyone who saw it. Even the Assyrians, famous for their brutality centuries before the Middle Ages, used flaying as a political tool. They weren't just punishing criminals, they were terrorizing entire populations. Carved depictions on palace walls sometimes showed the flayed bodies of enemies displayed in public squares. These images weren't artistic exaggeration, they were records, warnings, and propaganda rolled into one gruesome tableau. Medieval Europe inherited some of that logic, public punishment as a way to assert dominance, to crush dissent before it could fester. It's worth noting that flaying was not a punishment reserved for common criminals. High-ranking traitors, political opponents, or rebellious nobles were often the targets. The point wasn't to make a quiet statement, it was to make a statement that echoed through halls, markets, and villages alike. And because the act was so extreme, it lingered in people's minds in a way that fines, jail, or even mutilation couldn't achieve. Imagine walking through your village, seeing the aftermath of such a punishment. The fear, the horror, the silent agreement that stepping out of line was not worth the price. It was a kind of social reinforcement that left no room for negotiation. Now you might think, surely this is medieval barbarism at its worst. Were there really people doing this? And the answer is yes, though not everywhere, and not all the time. Europe had pockets of extreme punishment, and flaying occasionally appeared as the ultimate penalty for crimes that threatened the social order. In some cases, bodies were flayed posthumously as an added insult, meant to degrade even in death. But when flaying was performed alive, it represented the absolute control of authority over life, death, and personal dignity. The symbolic resonance of flaying is also fascinating. Think about it. Your skin is the boundary between you and the world. It's what separates your inner self from the chaos outside. By removing it, authorities weren't just ending a life, they were obliterating the social, moral, and psychological identity of a person. It was a punishment designed to resonate beyond the individual, to make entire communities internalize fear and obedience. Medieval justice loved punishments that served multiple purposes: retribution, deterrence, education, and spectacle. Flaying hit all four. Of course, we shouldn't ignore the sheer logistical horror of it. Executioners had to be skilled, fast, and precise, more for the sake of order and control than mercy. The act had to be carried out in a way that ensured the victim couldn't escape, the crowd could see the punishment clearly, and the message was unmistakable. These were not improvisations, they were orchestrated performances of terror. And yet the fact that flaying was occasionally recorded in European history speaks to the extremes that justice could reach when morality, law, and fear intersected. Even today, historians marvel at the creativity and cruelty of these punishments. In a way, flaying represents the pinnacle of medieval punishment theatre, where authority and fear danced together in the most literal, flesh and bone sense. Interestingly, flaying also had echoes in literature and chronicles. Medieval writers often recounted these punishments in gory detail, ensuring the lessons extended beyond the town square. The stories themselves became a form of punishment. Reading about it, hearing about it, imagining it, that fear spread far more widely than the event itself. And this is where the punishment truly gained power. It wasn't just about the one person who suffered. It was about shaping the imagination of the entire society. But medieval justice wasn't done with mere stripping of flesh. If flaying was the ultimate expression of power over the body, other punishments focused on breaking the body in different ways, twisting, crushing, dismembering, or burning, each with its own rules, symbols, and spectacle. The pattern was always the same. The more horrifying the method, the more effective the warning. Public punishment, in all its creative cruelty, was the medieval version of a viral social media post, except instead of memes, it was real, and the stakes were life and death. By this point, if you're beginning to see a pattern, you're not wrong. Medieval authorities were incredibly inventive. From humiliation to drowning, from scolds' bridles to flaying, the goal was always clear: punish, deter, and make sure everyone in the community learned the lesson without anyone needing a lengthy courtroom debate. And while flaying may be one of the most extreme examples, it's important to see it as part of a continuum, a spectrum of punishment that ranges from a splash in the ducking stool to the ultimate terror of having your skin peeled away while everyone watched. And speaking of breaking the body in more theatrical ways, the Middle Ages had yet another invention for the truly creative executioner, one that combined spectacle, pain, and sheer ingenuity, ensuring that justice was both memorable and, well, unforgettable. If you thought flaying was the apex of medieval brutality, think again. The breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel, was a punishment designed to make every bone in your body regret ever existing. This wasn't subtle, this wasn't mercy, this was medieval justice cranked up to 11, and it had all of the theatrical flair the Middle Ages loved. The concept was straightforward, if horrifyingly so. The accused would be tied down, usually spread eagle, to a large wooden wheel. And then came the breaking part. Executioners, armed with iron clubs or hammers, would systematically smash the victim's limbs. Knees, arms, ribs, legs, each strike intended to break bones without necessarily killing the person immediately. The goal? Slow, public, unforgettable pain. It sounds sadistic, and it absolutely was. But in the context of medieval justice, it made sense, or at least it made sense to those handing down the punishment. The breaking wheel served a dual purpose. First, it was punishment, not just a sentence, but an experience designed to leave the victim utterly destroyed physically. Second, it was entertainment. Medieval society loved a good spectacle, and this was one of the most gruesome yet efficient ways to captivate a crowd. Townspeople would gather, sometimes for hours, watching the slow, systematic destruction of a human body, while keeping the illusion of divine or legal justice intact. Victims were sometimes left on the wheel to die slowly, their shattered bodies exposed for all to see. The execution could last hours, even a full day, depending on how methodical or sadistic the executioner decided to be. It was a public event designed to instill fear, enforce authority, and remind everyone that crime and treachery came with a very literal price. The symbolism of the wheel added another layer. Wheels are circular, continuous, inescapable. Tying someone to a wheel, then shattering them on it, sent a message that crime and punishment are inevitable cycles, mess with society, and your suffering is guaranteed to spin endlessly before the public eye. In some cases, the wheel itself would become a display, the victim mounted atop it after their death as a warning to passers-by. Medieval justice wasn't subtle, but it was unforgettable. Interestingly, the breaking wheel wasn't just about brutality, it was also about precision. Executioners developed a kind of grim artistry, learning exactly how to strike bones to prolong suffering without accidentally killing too quickly. Timing was everything. A too powerful blow could end the show early, which defeated the purpose. Too weak, and the person might survive long enough to escape, or the crowd might get bored. Like a macabre performance, it required skill, calculation, and nerves of steel. And yes, audiences did watch. Crowds gathered in market squares, village centres, and outside prison gates, all eager to witness the spectacle. For some, it was a social event, a break from the monotony of medieval life. For others, it was a morality lesson writ in human flesh. Disobedience, betrayal, or crime would be met with a punishment so extreme no one could possibly ignore it. Unlike modern warnings or fines, the breaking wheel was undeniably persuasive. The breaking wheel also served as a stark reminder of the social hierarchy. Ordinary people might be tied to the wheel for theft or rebellion, but nobles, they might face a more merciful execution, beheading for example, but the principle was the same. Punishment had to be visible, unmistakable, and exemplary. The power of the wheel lay not just in pain, but in visibility. It was theatre and terror, justice and performance, all rolled into one wooden circle. Historical examples show just how widespread the practice was across Europe. In France, Germany, and the Low Countries, records describe victims being broken slowly, sometimes in public squares for days, their shattered bodies left as grim warnings. In some German towns, the executioner was almost a celebrity in his own right, praised for the precision of his strikes and the spectacle he created. The wheel even had a notorious cultural afterlife. It inspired legends, literature, and art. Writers and chroniclers often depicted the punishment in vivid detail, not just to record history, but to amplify its terrifying moral lesson. A tale of a criminal on the breaking wheel could travel far beyond the village square, reaching neighboring towns and ensuring that the fear of punishment extended well beyond local borders. It's also worth noting the psychological dimension. The breaking wheel didn't just punish the body, it punished the mind. Victims often experienced prolonged terror as they realized what was about to happen and watched others suffer before their turn. The crowd's presence amplified the horror. You weren't alone, and everyone knew your fate. Public shame, fear, and pain were all part of the sentence, layered on top of the physical suffering. And yet the breaking wheel, as horrific as it sounds, fits neatly into the broader pattern of medieval punishment. Like flaying alive, scolds bridles, or trials by ordeal, it wasn't random cruelty. It was designed, calculated, and purposeful. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't private, it was public, performative, and meant to leave a lasting impression. Every punishment told a story, and the breaking wheel told one in bone-crushing, unforgettable detail. But the Middle Ages didn't rely solely on bone-breaking and public spectacles to enforce obedience. Some punishments took a more peculiar approach, blending humiliation, confinement, and a flair for the bizarre. These were punishments that made you question not just justice, but creativity itself, the kind that made townsfolk chuckle nervously while the victims suffered. Medieval law had a surprising sense of theatrical irony. And speaking of theatrical, bizarre, and creatively cruel, there was yet another category of punishment that combined shame, discomfort, and relentless public scrutiny, proving once again that medieval authorities loved solutions that hit mind, body, and social standing all at once. By this point, you might think medieval punishments had hit peak creativity, and yet there's one legendary device that takes the crown for sheer psychological terror: the Iron Maiden. You've probably heard about it in documentaries or online horror lists, a tall, coffin-shaped enclosure lined with spikes, designed to impale anyone foolish enough to enter. Just the idea is enough to make modern viewers shiver. But like many tales from the Middle Ages, the reality is a little more complicated and perhaps a little less gruesome than legend would have it. Let's set the scene. The Iron Maiden is said to have been a large, human-sized sarcophagus made of iron. The inside of the door was lined with sharp spikes, arranged so that when closed, they would pierce the victim in non-vital areas, so you'd experience extreme pain, but not instant death. The intent was cruelly clever: maximize terror, slow suffering, and make the punishment unforgettable. Its aesthetic was designed for dramatic effect, with a skeletal face often sculpted on the outside, like death itself welcoming you to your fate. But here's where the story gets interesting. Historians debate whether the Iron Maiden was actually used in the Middle Ages, or if it was largely a later invention, possibly even a product of 18th or 19th century imagination. Some evidence suggests that devices labeled as Iron Maidens in museums were actually assembled or modified centuries later, perhaps inspired by descriptions of earlier instruments of torture. So, while it's entirely possible that some version existed, its fearsome reputation may have outpaced its historical reality. In other words, it's the medieval equivalent of a horror movie villain, maybe real, maybe not, but absolutely terrifying either way. Regardless of its actual use, the Iron Maiden serves as a perfect example of medieval justice's psychological dimension. Even if only a few people ever saw it in action, or if it never truly impaled anyone, the very idea of being locked inside a spiked coffin was enough to terrify and control. You see, medieval authorities understood a simple truth. Fear can be just as effective a tool as pain. Make people imagine the worst possible fate and they're more likely to follow the rules. Sometimes, imagination is the most efficient executioner of all. Descriptive accounts, whether factual or embellished, portray the device as meticulously terrifying. The spikes were placed with careful precision, designed to injure but not kill immediately. The victim would be trapped, standing or leaning against the inner walls, unable to move, with every sharp point strategically aimed to inflict maximum agony. And even if the Iron Maiden was rarely used, or perhaps never at all in some regions, the notion of it could haunt entire towns. It became a symbol of ultimate punishment, whispered about in courtrooms, town squares, and taverns alike. The Iron Maiden also highlights a critical aspect of medieval justice: the blending of spectacle, moral instruction, and theatre. Like the breaking wheel, it wasn't merely about pain, it was about sending a message. Authorities knew that people learned as much from stories and threats as from actual punishment. And a story about a spiked coffin that could crush your flesh while leaving your life hanging by a thread? That's the kind of story that sticks in the collective imagination. It's also worth noting the clever irony of the device. The victim's body might survive the initial enclosure, yet the mind was the first to crack. Fear, anticipation, and helplessness often magnified suffering far beyond the physical damage. Whether used or purely symbolic, the Iron Maiden exemplifies the medieval obsession with punishing not only the body but the spirit, making sure the lesson of obedience lingered long after the event or the story had passed. Even the design itself is a lesson in morbid ingenuity. From the menacing skeletal face on the exterior to the precisely arranged spikes inside, the Iron Maiden combined artistry and cruelty. It wasn't just functional, it was performative, and performance mattered in medieval justice. Every punishment was meant to teach, warn, and entertain the audience of onlookers. The Iron Maiden, real or mythical, perfectly embodied this philosophy, a horrifying spectacle that lingered in memory, whispered from one generation to the next. There's also a broader lesson in the legend of the Iron Maiden. Medieval punishment didn't always rely on actual execution or physical suffering. Sometimes the reputation of a device, the threat of horror, and the fear it inspired were enough to control behavior. Even if only a few unlucky individuals faced the spikes, the collective imagination of society did most of the work. Think of it as medieval psychological warfare with iron and spikes as the tools of persuasion. And of course, the Iron Maiden is just one example of a larger pattern. Medieval justice loved extremes, whether for physical suffering, social humiliation, or psychological terror. From ducking stools to flaying alive, from the breaking wheel to imagined spiked coffins, the spectrum of punishment was wide, inventive, and unapologetically theatrical. It was a world where creativity and cruelty knew no bounds, and the line between fact and legend often blurred in the process. In the end, the Iron Maiden, whether historical reality or exaggerated myth, captures the essence of medieval punishment perfectly. It combines fear, spectacle, and moral instruction in a way that few other devices could. It reminds us that the Middle Ages weren't just about laws and decrees. They were about storytelling, about crafting experiences that shaped behavior, and about ensuring that justice, however harsh, left a lasting impression. And as unnerving as the Iron Maiden sounds, medieval society had even stranger, more bizarre punishments in store. If you thought spiked coffins were the peak of creativity, prepare yourself. Some punishments relied not on spikes or fire, but on absurdity, humiliation, and relentless public spectacle. Medieval justice could be inventive in ways that made the scold's bridle seem downright clever by comparison. If you thought the Iron Maiden was terrifying, the medieval imagination still had room for something even more unusual. Meet Poena Culli, also known as the sack of animals, a punishment that's equal parts bizarre, cruel, and ritualistic, and one that would make even the most seasoned executioner raise an eyebrow. Unlike the breaking wheel or flaying, this punishment relied on chaos itself to deliver justice, literally stuffing a person into a confined space with a motley assortment of creatures and letting nature, fear, and water do the rest. Poena Culli has roots in ancient Roman law, where it was prescribed for the crime of parricide, killing one's own parent. In a society that held family and ancestry as sacred, this crime was considered the ultimate violation. The punishment, therefore, was designed to be extraordinary, grotesque, and unforgettable. The guilty party would be sewn into a large sack along with live animals, snakes, dogs, cats, and sometimes even monkeys, then thrown into a river or the sea to drown. It's a punishment that combines physical danger, terror, and a sense of ritualized symbolism in a way few others can. Just imagine it. The criminal, struggling, confined, and surrounded by animals that are equally terrified and potentially aggressive, thrashes in the dark fabric of the sack. Panic sets in almost immediately. Every movement risks a bite, a scratch, or a painful collision with the struggling animals. Then comes the water. Immersed and suffocating, the drowning becomes a horrifying endgame for a punishment that was never meant to be quick or merciful. The suffering was total, and the spectacle, had it been public, was equally unforgettable. But what makes Poena Culli so fascinating isn't just the physical terror, it's the symbolism. Each animal represented something chaotic and untamed. Snakes symbolized treachery and deceit. Dogs represented uncontrolled aggression. Cats, cunning and unpredictability. Monkeys, foolishness or mockery. By stuffing the criminal into a sack with these creatures, the authorities were essentially enacting a physical allegory. Chaos itself devours the wrongdoer. Justice wasn't just punishment, it was narrative. The crime of violating sacred familial bonds had to be answered with a punishment that told a story, one that could be read by all who witnessed or heard about it. The visual of the sack of animals also served a clear social purpose. In a time without television, newspapers, or social media, stories traveled through townsfolk, marketplaces, and taverns. Witnesses would recount the horror in vivid detail, amplifying the psychological impact far beyond the immediate event. It was justice, education, and entertainment all rolled into one. Medieval authorities understood that fear spread faster when combined with spectacle, symbolism, and a dash of the bizarre. Interestingly, poena culae didn't appear all the time. It was rare and reserved for what were considered particularly heinous crimes. The combination of planning, ritual, and sheer logistical difficulty meant that this punishment wasn't casual. It was intended to shock, terrify, and mark the crime as an absolute violation of social and divine order. Unlike the breaking wheel or flaying, which were sometimes used for common criminals, the sack of animals was a statement. Some crimes were so unnatural that nature itself would participate in the punishment. And yes, it's as chaotic as it sounds. Imagine being tossed into a sack with several terrified, struggling animals, all thrashing in panic as the water rises. The human body is confined and cannot move freely, and every kick or claw adds to the terror. The drowning itself was a slow, horrifying ordeal, often leaving witnesses with a sense of awe, horror, and disbelief. The punishment functioned on multiple levels: physical suffering, psychological horror, and the public's perception of divine justice. Another fascinating aspect is the ritualistic nature of the punishment. It wasn't just about drowning a criminal. The sack, the selection of animals, and the method of immersion were carefully prescribed to reflect cosmic or moral symbolism. Law, justice, and superstition all intertwined in a single act. The medieval mindset, and even earlier Roman thought, saw a deep connection between moral violations and cosmic balance. In this framework, poena culae wasn't merely cruelty, it was restoring order in a universe temporarily thrown into chaos by parricide or similarly heinous acts. Yet, despite its seeming theatricality, this punishment was terrifyingly effective. Even if most people would never experience it firsthand, the mere knowledge that such an end awaited the worst offenders reinforced obedience, moral behavior, and social norms. It wasn't the most common punishment, but its reputation carried weight. Sometimes imagination alone was enough to keep people in line, which is why the stories of the sack of animals persisted long after it fell out of use. The imagery of humans and animals confined together in darkness also inspired later cultural depictions. Chroniclers, writers, and even early illustrators of medieval texts would exaggerate the scene, ensuring that the lesson of chaos devouring wrongdoing remained vivid in the collective imagination. It's a reminder that medieval punishment was often as much about storytelling as it was about law. The more memorable and bizarre the story, the more effective the lesson. And here's the thing, poena culae sits at a fascinating intersection of cruelty and creativity. Unlike the breaking wheel, which relied on physical destruction, or the scold's bridle, which relied on public humiliation, the sack of animals blends ritual, spectacle, and psychological terror. It's almost performance art, but the stakes are horrifyingly real. In a society obsessed with cosmic order, moral hierarchy, and social obedience, the punishment was both logical and terrifyingly imaginative. What's perhaps most striking is that even in the darkest corners of medieval justice, there's a kind of twisted logic at play. Every punishment had a purpose beyond pain: humiliation, deterrence, moral instruction, or symbolic resonance. The sack of animals may be one of the strangest examples, but it fits neatly into the broader pattern of creative, extreme, and memorable justice. It shows how authorities leveraged imagination to reinforce order and control, and how cruelty could be dressed up in symbolism to make it socially, and sometimes spiritually, meaningful. And as bizarre as it seems, poena culae is only one part of a larger spectrum. Medieval justice had no shortage of creativity when it came to public humiliation, painful spectacle, or psychological terror. From stocks and pillories to flaying, breaking wheels, and imaginary Iron Maidens, the Middle Ages were full of inventive, and sometimes absurd, ways to punish. Each punishment was a story, a warning, and a reflection of society's values taken to extremes that modern viewers can barely imagine. Which brings us to the next layer of medieval creativity: punishments that weren't just painful or terrifying, but downright ridiculous, combining humiliation, discomfort, and public spectacle in ways that left victims shivering, shaking, and wishing for a quieter fate. If you thought animals in a sack were strange, the next punishment takes absurdity and social shaming to a whole new level. If you thought medieval punishments had a line, you'd be wrong. Somewhere past the scold's bridle, the Iron Maiden, and even the sack of animals, justice entered a territory that was as extreme as it was theatrical. Let's talk about drawing and quartering, the European cousin of the notorious Chinese punishment lingqi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts. A grim reminder of how seriously medieval states treated traitors and enemies of the crown. Drawing and quartering was primarily reserved for those accused of high treason in medieval England. The crime wasn't just disloyalty, it was a direct affront to the authority of the monarch and the very fabric of society. And the punishment was designed to match the crime in sheer, unforgettable horror. The convicted traitor would first be dragged to the place of execution, usually tied to a wooden hurdle or even a horse. Imagine being literally pulled through the streets, exposed to the jeering, terrified, or even sympathetic townspeople along the way. The procession itself was a performance, a living warning, a grim parade, and public theatre all rolled into one. Once at the execution site, the first stage often involved hanging, but unlike a standard hanging, it wasn't necessarily intended to kill quickly. Sometimes, the victim would be taken to the brink of death, ensuring prolonged suffering. Then came the brutal and frankly grisly part: dismemberment. Limbs were severed, organs removed, and the body often divided into 4 parts, hence the term quartered. Each piece might be displayed in different parts of the kingdom as a stark, visible reminder of the cost of treason. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was state power made flesh, terrifyingly literal and unavoidably public. The logic of the punishment was both symbolic and theatrical. Drawing and quartering was about demonstrating that betrayal disrupted the natural and social order. A traitor's body, once divided, was a physical metaphor for the consequences of fracturing society itself. Authority wasn't just maintained, it was broadcast, a visceral warning that the crown's reach was absolute. And yes, the medieval mindset often saw the suffering of the traitor as a moral lesson for the living. Sin against your sovereign, and your body, reputation, and legacy will all be obliterated in plain view. It's easy to imagine modern readers recoiling, but in the Middle Ages this was part of how justice worked. Punishment wasn't private, it wasn't sanitized, and it certainly wasn't subtle. Crowds gathered to watch, some curious, some horrified, some morbidly entertained. Executioners developed a grim expertise, learning how to inflict maximum suffering while maintaining the spectacle's dramatic impact. Every cut, every quartered limb was intended to send a message as clear as any royal decree. And while England's quartering was perhaps the most notorious in Europe, it wasn't unique in its extremity. Other medieval societies had similar practices, often inspired by the same principle: make the punishment so visible, so extreme, that no one dares cross the line. The Chinese practice of lingqi, though separated by geography and culture, operated under a similar idea. A traitor's body could be methodically and publicly destroyed in a slow, agonizing performance. The human body becomes a canvas for state authority, and terror itself becomes the medium. But what's particularly fascinating about drawing and quartering is the way it blends spectacle and moral instruction. Unlike a simple hanging or beheading, quartering was intentionally theatrical. Townspeople would not only witness the suffering but interpret it. The execution was a story told in flesh and blood about the dangers of betrayal, the fragility of loyalty, and the absolute power of the state. It's gruesome, yes, but also brutally efficient in sending a message that no one could ignore. Symbolism, as with other medieval punishments, was crucial. Each step, the dragging, the hanging, the dismemberment, the public display of body parts, told a layered story. It communicated the consequences of treason, reinforced the sacred authority of the king, and turned fear into a moral instrument. By the end of the ritual, the traitor was not just dead. They had become a permanent warning, a living cautionary tale etched into memory, literature, and local legend. It's also worth noting the psychological dimension, the anticipation of punishment, the dragging, the crowd, the slow process of dismemberment was designed to instill terror before physical pain even began. Execution wasn't just an event, it was a performance that targeted mind and body, creating lasting impressions on both the victim and the witnesses. Medieval authorities knew that punishment's effectiveness depended on perception, not just action. Fear spread faster than steel ever could. Even though quartering is one of the most infamous punishments, it shares DNA with less extreme but still theatrical methods like the stocks, pillories, or ducking stools. Each punishment relied on public engagement, moral instruction, and sometimes a dash of absurdity. Medieval justice wasn't about rehabilitation or quiet imprisonment, it was about maintaining social order through visibility, creativity, and, frankly, spectacle. And while drawing and quartering may seem barbaric to us today, it highlights the mindset of a world where law, morality, and entertainment often overlapped. In that context, the punishment made sense. If you challenge the crown, your body becomes a story, a warning, and a symbol, ensuring that the lesson echoes far beyond the execution site. It's extreme, theatrical, and terrifying, but in the logic of medieval authority, it was completely rational. Yet as grim as this sounds, medieval justice wasn't limited to cutting, impaling, or drowning. Some punishments took a lighter, or at least more absurd, approach, blending humiliation, discomfort, and social ridicule in ways that could torment the mind as much as the body. It was proof that creativity in punishment wasn't limited to pain. Sometimes public shaming was just as powerful, if not more so. And that brings us seamlessly into the next chapter of bizarre medieval punishments, where humiliation, spectacle, and the simple absurdity of social ridicule take center stage. Here the law turns to mockery, turning guilty parties into objects of laughter, discomfort, and endless public attention, sometimes more terrifying than even the most physically brutal punishments. If you thought medieval punishments had already pushed the limits of imagination, the final act of our tour into the bizarre, brutal, and often bewildering world of justice is burning at the stake. Unlike the scold's bridle, the sack of animals, or even drawing and quartering, fire brought something elemental to punishment, an immediate, undeniable, and terrifyingly visible assertion of authority. It wasn't just pain, it was purification, performance, and power, all rolled into one dramatic spectacle. Burning at the stake was primarily used for those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or other offenses that threatened the spiritual and moral order of medieval society. These crimes weren't just legal violations, they were assaults on the divine, the church, and the moral fabric of the community. And fire, with its raw, purifying symbolism, was considered the perfect medium. The flames didn't just destroy the body, they symbolically cleansed the soul, returning the offender to the divine in a way that the medieval mind found strangely comforting and logically satisfying. Picture it, the accused tied to a wooden stake in a public square, surrounded by townsfolk, nobles, and church officials. Smoke rises, flames lick the timber, and the crowd watches as justice unfolds before their eyes. The punishment was as much for the audience as for the criminal. Every flicker of flame, every crackle of burning wood was a lesson in obedience, morality, and the consequences of transgression. This is medieval social media, except instead of likes and shares, you have roaring crowds, gasps, and collective moral instruction. Fire was chosen deliberately. Beyond the spectacle, it carried profound symbolic weight. In a time when religion permeated law and culture, fire was associated with both divine wrath and divine cleansing. Heretics, witches, and blasphemers weren't just criminals, they were spiritually corrupted. Flames offered a way to eradicate that corruption visibly and definitively. It wasn't subtle, it was absolute, leaving no doubt about the power of church and state combined. But let's not forget the psychological dimension. Watching someone burn at the stake was terrifying, and that terror was precisely the point. Medieval authorities understood that punishment was performance, deterrence, and storytelling all at once. The horror wasn't confined to the condemned, it spread through the crowd. Parents used the spectacle to teach children about obedience. Villagers discussed the event in taverns, marketplaces, and homes. Chroniclers recorded it for future generations. The punishment became a story, a warning, and a lesson embedded in collective memory. Burning at the stake also highlights a broader truth about medieval justice. It was about control as much as correction. Punishment had to be public, memorable, and morally instructive. Whether it was stocks, pillories, ducking stools, or fire, the goal was consistent: reinforce social norms, instill fear, and demonstrate the power of law in a world where authority was maintained as much by perception as by legislation. The medieval mindset understood that terror could be an effective enforcer, and that creativity could make punishment unforgettable. Interestingly, the use of fire also blends physical suffering with symbolism, a hallmark of the most effective medieval punishments. Physical pain, while central, was never the only objective. The emotional, moral, and communal impact mattered just as much. The spectacle of burning made an abstract crime, heresy, witchcraft, betrayal, tangible, understandable, and, most importantly, memorable for anyone witnessing it. Pain becomes narrative, agony becomes lesson, and fire becomes a medium of moral storytelling. When you step back and look at all the bizarre medieval punishments we've explored, from the stocks and pillories to ducking stools, scolds' bridles, trial by ordeal, flaying, breaking wheels, Iron Maidens, sacks of animals, and drawing and quartering, you start to notice a pattern. Each punishment was designed to communicate, to enforce social norms, and to establish authority in ways that went far beyond simply incarcerating or executing someone. The creativity, theatricality, and sometimes absurd ingenuity of these punishments ensured that the lessons lingered long after the event. Medieval justice wasn't about subtlety. It wasn't about quiet punishment in a sterile room. It was a public performance, a social event, and a moral lesson all at once. Sometimes it relied on fear, sometimes on pain, and sometimes on humiliation or absurdity. But the principle was the same: make it unforgettable, make it visible, make it carry meaning. And in a time when law, religion, and social order were deeply intertwined, this approach made terrifyingly efficient sense. At the same time, reflecting on these punishments reminds us of the human capacity for creativity, both admirable and horrifying. Medieval societies channeled imagination into enforcing law and morality in ways that modern sensibilities often find extreme, cruel, or absurd. But within their context, each device, each spectacle, and each ritual had logic, symbolism, and intent. From the simple stocks to the horrifying extremity of the stake or quartering, each punishment tells a story about what people valued, feared, and sought to control. And yet there's also a lesson in how law evolves. Many of these punishments, once considered routine or necessary, gradually faded from use. Societies shifted, sensibilities changed, and the brutal theatre of medieval justice was replaced by more regulated, humane, and often less public systems of punishment. What once relied on spectacle and fear gave way to imprisonment, fines, and eventually rehabilitation. The medieval era serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of fascination, a window into a world where law, theatre, and cruelty were inseparable. Fire, in particular, reminds us that punishment in medieval times was never just about the individual. It was about the collective psyche. The community learned, feared, and remembered. Authorities demonstrated control, and morality was enacted as both narrative and ritual. Every act, from the scold's bridle to burning at the stake, reinforced a societal order that relied on visibility, participation, and memory. So as we consider burning at the stake, we see the culmination of a broader philosophy of justice. Medieval punishments were multifaceted: pain, symbolism, moral instruction, deterrence, spectacle, all carefully combined to achieve maximum effect. Fire was just the most elemental, most absolute expression of that philosophy. And yet it wasn't an end point. It was part of a continuum of creativity, cruelty, and social theatre that defined justice in the Middle Ages. In a sense, these punishments also highlight the human fascination with extremes. Medieval authorities experimented with physical suffering, public humiliation, and psychological terror in ways that are almost unimaginable today. They pushed the boundaries of what could be conceived as punishment and control, creating a legacy of both horror and fascination that continues to intrigue historians, writers, and curious minds alike. And so, as we step back from the spectacle of fire, the grotesque creativity of devices, and the extreme rituals of medieval justice, it's clear that these punishments were never just about hurting people. They were about telling a story, shaping behavior, and reinforcing the social order in unforgettable ways. They are bizarre, inventive, terrifying, and from a historical perspective, oddly fascinating. And as we move on, we'll begin to reflect on how these extremes of justice shaped not just the medieval world, but the way we think about law, punishment, and society itself. The legacy of medieval creativity and punishment offers lessons, warnings, and even insights into the human psyche. A story that extends beyond fire, stakes, and wheels into the imagination, morality, and culture of entire societies.